Hi, so welcome to our third podcast episode. And I think we should introduce ourselves again for anyone new who's joining us for the first time. So we'll start with Di this time.
Hello, I'm Diane, Diane Coates Sinclair, and I'm the co-founder and director of the Sculpture School with Andy.
I'm Andrew Sinclair, and I'm the main sculptor. I'm a commercial sculptor, and I really want to share the skills that I've learned over the last 30 years. So I am the main tutor at the Sculpture School, passing on those skills.
I'm Lindsay Jan Bauer, and I work at the Sculpture School I started there as an art model, but I'm now a creative arts exec. And I'm also studying a history PhD at Bristol University about Italian Renaissance women, which covers lots of aspects of art. Okay, so with all of that done, let's kick off. So,
that sounds pretty awesome, darling. You sound better than me.
No, not at all. I think lots of mutual respect between us all. So how's your weekend been?
It's been very interesting, actually.
Well, we've had an amazing week. Actually,
yeah, so we've taken a little break.
Okay.
And we went to study with the Frouds, if anybody knows who the Frouds are. Do you want to explain, Annie?
Yes, Brian and Wendy Froud are very famous in the sort of fantasy fae world. Wendy was a puppeteer and doll maker, and she is the she created Yoda, didn't she, for Star Wars?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. And Brian is an incredible artist who is the author of multiple books on the fairies and all the sort of magical mystery worlds. That's not a very good description, really.
No, it isn't. But I think they gained their notoriety through working with Jim Henson.
Oh
yeah,
and on the Muppets and all those really iconic programs that were created through puppets. I always feel deeply honoured to know them, actually. It's such a different world to ours.
Yeah,
that's like such a particular genre, isn't it? And I know where the Frouds live, and we moved there as a family to that area. And when we first got there, just realised there's this huge circle of friends who were all involved in this kind of otherworldly form of art. So,
yes.
For listeners, is the kind of art that you see if you think of like some of Tolkien's figures and, you know, those sort of mystical creatures in the woods. And then, as you were saying, when Brian and Wendy went to or worked with Jim Henson and Muppets. And so it's this whole like other section of art and creativity.
Yeah, and for me, it was doing something that put me on the other side. I'm always tutoring these days and teaching, and I think it's very good when you're doing something like this to just experience what it's like on the other side. So I try and do something like this once a year, so that I get the anxiety that the people that are sitting in front of me are getting. It just makes everything more empathetic and run better, I think, as a teacher.
It's really good for us to go and study somewhere else and learn new skills, to understand how other people work, and to learn a whole new genre of sculpture that we don't normally get involved with at all, do we?
No.
It was quite incredible actually being in this amazing 13th century house behind Chagford, which was stunning. It sort of we were immersed in this magical world instantly just because of the landscape and the atmosphere.
And the whole approach is very different to ours, which I think you need. We have a kind of institution now because we've been teaching for so long, and it's good to be taught by somebody else who has a completely different take. I personally, I really enjoyed it. I felt we really needed it as well.
It was a proper holiday. It was really quite magical, actually, because the weather was amazing and the whole atmosphere was incredible.
Yeah, I think we both threw ourselves into it. And I was stitching all weekend, so that's really out of my comfort zone.
And you were surrounded by women, weren't you? Completely. Apart from Brian?
Apart from Brian.
Yeah. And also, just for listeners, so where Di mentioned Chagford. So Chagford is kind of sort of middle to the edges of Dartmoor. So Dartmoor National Park, and it's very beautiful. It's got parts where it's wild, and there's a place called Wistman's Wood, isn't there? I don't know
on
if you've been
Dartmoor.
there. Yeah, and it's so again, that feels quite otherworldly. It's got these tiny trees, and they're sort of gnarled and bent over because of the winds. And
I think Wistman's Wood is Froud World.
Absolutely.
It's where you'd see his creation.
Yeah, it's got that sort of magical feel. So I think the whole where Brian and Wendy are based already sort of takes you into something that feels kind of as though you're stepping into like a C.S. Lewis, like Narnia kind of world, doesn't it?
It is. It's very magical. And it's where we, in fact, on the first day of the workshop, we were taken to a river near where the Frouds live, and it's where they gain their inspiration. And so we were kind of walking in their footsteps, really, weren't we, along the riverbank and sketching, and a couple of the people went swimming in the river.
Yeah, open swimming.
Yeah, it was just fantastic. Yeah,
and meditation. It was all what I wanted it to be, really, a completely different break.
Different world. And also, didn't you go to a pagan kind of celebration? Is that right? How would you describe it?
Oh, on May Day, yes, we went to up to Haytor, which is one of the biggest tors on Dartmoor, and it was in celebration of Beltane, which is springtime, and we were watching Beltane Border Morris, who are the most amazing Morris group that you could ever come across. They're kind of steampunk and really incredible
Sexy Morris,
band.
if I can say that, because it's not what you'd associate.
Yeah,
there's no jingle bells.
Morris dancing, this is, but like an offshoot or like a more because all the Morris dancers that's actually going to tie in with something I'm going to talk about in a minute. All the Morris dancers normally have their own little kind of ways, don't I guess it's a bit like football teams or something. They all have their own kind of
they have different costumes. And
so this is a slightly more out there.
I would say yes, it's more visceral, I suppose pagan, I don't know, but it's very
lots of roaring, shouting.
Yeah,
it's visceral is a good word for it.
Yeah,
it's just exciting to watch.
And they've got their band, so there's a very rhythmic drum beat. They write their own songs, create their own dances, so it's not just old traditions that they're celebrating, they're creating new ones as well, which is amazing.
Because, a lot of Morris dancers, I'm just talking about them briefly because when I studied, so in my undergrad history degree at Bristol University, I did a unit on ancient sort of historical paganism, and and that was with an amazing man called Ronald Hutton, Professor Ronald Hutton. He's on the BBC quite a lot, and he's also a Druid. He's just like the coolest. Bless him. If you ever hear this, Ronald. He wrote me a reference, so I'm very fond of him. So Ronald talked a lot about different pagan traditions and celebrations, and obviously because he's a Druid, went to Stonehenge and things, or still goes. But one of the weeks, one of our lessons one week or seminar groups I had to give a talk on, presentation on, was about Morris dancers and also green men. And we're going to come back to green men later and I'll explain what they are. But with the Morris dancers, I had to study them quite a lot. And it was so interesting because it's all about England's folk scene, isn't it? And this is what I'm going to come back to now. Many of the Morris dancers, sort of the different bands that are around the UK, and Morris dancing it's sad because, like we were talking a little bit about sculpture in previous podcasts, that unless we really go out there and push these traditional ways of being and doing and making and celebrating life, they will get lost in time, won't they? And there are fewer Morris men dancing kind of troupes now compared to what they used to be. But most of them tend to wear sort of white costumes and they have the bells and things. But I think the group that you went to see, did they have like black feathers, or am I?
They wear sort of steampunk style hats, don't they? Stovepipes and all covered in feathers. They have painted faces and tatters. Actually, they're called the sort of their knee-length jackets with lots of different.
But they used to black up,
yes.
which means painting your face black. but they're not allowed to do that anymore, which is such a great shame. It's got nothing to do with race. It's got everything to do
with history,
and keeping yourself secret, because if you were seen to be dancing in the late 1600s during the Cromwellian period, you could be put in prison or killed. So people still desperately wanted to honour these festivals and celebrate them. But they couldn't be seen to be doing so. So I think it's a fantastic history and a great shame that it's been cancelled.
I think, it's so hard, isn't it? Because today's sort of sensibilities are very black and white, but that doesn't allow for the nuance, which is involved in all of these old traditions and ways of being. And I think we've got to be really careful that we don't lose these aspects of what is part of our culture and our heritage, and we don't become so kind of sanitized that we no longer represent all the different diverse people and beliefs and cultural aspects.
It's people that are coming in with no knowledge. They just see it from a very peripheral point of view, interpret it completely wrongly, and are not interested in any aspect of that. So it's a tragic dumbing down, I think.
Yeah, I think that's so true. It's always, I know we're going to talk about things like this later on in our different episodes, but, talking about some of the previous kind of artists, sculptors who now would be sort of instantly cancelled because of whatever, one episode in
nearly
their
all
lives.
of them, poets as well. All of them would be cancelled.
And I think, like today's society feels very puritanical, and we've just got to be so careful that we keep these traditions going and we try and keep them as they are, as they originally were. Obviously we have to respect modern society and views and diversity and everything, but also it's respecting heritage and traditions. It's trying to
very much
sort of meet in the middle, isn't it? Get that balance right.
So we've been steeped in it this week.
Yes,
and
we have.
Actually we had to get up at 4:00 in the morning to go to Beltane.
Because it started at dawn. It was spectacular on the way, wasn't it? Because there was lightning in the sky on the way.
Yeah.
So it was incredibly atmospheric, fort lightning coming down everywhere. But we were in a little place of peace. There was no rain. It was just the sound.
With the sun
and then
coming
the
up
music
behind
and
us.
the fiery torches and everything else. They certainly did an excellent job.
It was fantastic.
I thought it was fantastic.
No, that sounds incredible. And we're going to talk a little bit later about working in polymer, because that's what you worked in, the material you worked in. When you're at the Frouds, because you weren't just there for a jolly, you were there to get making,
learning new skills. Yes, and I actually made a Beltane Border Morris dancer, which I was really pleased with. I was well and truly inspired after the Thursday morning to make her look great.
So it was lovely. Diane always makes things that are joyous and lovely. And the creation that I created was an ancient priestess, because I was thinking of our modern evolution, which I would say has happened over the last 45,000 years, when we started to draw and create shapes, sculpt in effect. We've been building up a kind of other world that's part of our imagination. And I think that imagination has power behind it. If we believe collectively in something, it becomes true. A very good example of that is money. Money and the value of it doesn't exist. Particularly now, if we don't have enough gold to cover the debts and the money that is already being created. So collectively, we believe in money, and money becomes something that is true because of the belief. It's more powerful than people think it is, and so the creation that I created, I think it slightly worried Brian Froud, because he referred to us as the evil corner. That was entirely down to
dark.
me.
He's much darker than I am.
Your sculpture is quite a figure. When I saw it on the table at the sculpture school, we definitely need to put some photos up, don't we?
We will.
Illustrate what you created. But, like when I saw your figure, and I saw Di's is very colourful, isn't it? And so this, for listeners, this is what Di and Andy created at this workshop with Brian and Wendy Froud last week, and they were working with polymer, creating these figures. We'll explain more about and what it means compared to other materials a little bit later on. But so Di's figure is very colourful and joyous and
hair
interesting.
flowing.
And I was like, oh, and there was orange on it, wasn't there? And I'm just looking at what you're wearing now. And then Andy's character was like, it's like dark,
scary.
Yeah, dark. Definitely had that sort of spooky presence, but really interesting. And
I think it was to do with, I was thinking, and I have been thinking for quite a while actually, about the Fey world, because we knew that we were going on this course.
Can you just explain for listeners what you mean by the Fey world?
The Fey world is another world for fairy world. So it's a kind of alternative world, another dimension, if you like. And my take on it is that we have been creating that world, which became what we see now as superstition. We've been creating it for tens of thousands of years, and it resonates as it develops and builds as part of our imagination, I think, but it doesn't make it any less real, I don't think. So, and one of the things that's always interested me, historically speaking, particularly the Romans, for example, when they came to Britain, they were genuinely afraid, not because of our military might, which was nothing compared to theirs. What they were afraid of was what was in the woods, what was in the forests. You've got to remember that Britain was covered in forests, so was most of Europe. And within that forest land were groups of, or tribes of people that were developing their own beliefs. Those beliefs going back tens of thousands of years already by the time the Romans had arrived. And I'm just fascinated by that. There's a connection to nature through the kind of mother goddess, the Gaia, but there is also a dark side to it. It's a yin and a yang. It's very much good and evil. And I think that was the melting point that created the Fey world that is part of Brian and Wendy's world.
I think, it's so interesting because I think in daily life today, I was thinking of some jobs that I've done in the past before I sort of got into like doing my PhD and sort of working more in sort of the art sector. I think I used to work in law and teaching, and those are very sort of desk-based jobs, and you sort of lose touch with that whole ethereal element to life. But we all know it's there. Like, you can be a scientist working in a lab, but you can have an interest in, I don't know, like some idea of life after death, or in like ancient history with the sort of Greeks and goddesses that you were sort of referring to, Andy, and not just not just sort of Greek gods and goddesses, but that whole element of the unknown, the sort of otherworldly, like we're looking at this figure sculptor here, and we're going to talk more about it later on, Andy. But when I first saw it, and I know it's not quite what I thought it was, but I was thinking of King Arthur, and the sort of whole, like, people have been diving out on King Arthur stories.
Yes,
but that's because it's interesting. Look, human beings are interesting with stuff. Like, did it exist? What's true about it? What's it based on? Like, what's magical? What's fictionalized? And it's because we love this sort of concept of things that we don't fully understand, we don't fully know. And I think, if, maybe this is a good time to introduce what I was going to talk about just briefly. Talking about really materials. So when we sculpt, there's a range of different materials that can be used. And obviously at the sculpture school, Andy, you teach in clay, don't you? And then
water-based clay, natural clay.
And students can, if they want to, ultimately have their sculptures turned into bronzes, can't they? Bronze resins. Why did you choose bronze and clay? And can you tell us about different materials? So off we go.
The reason that I work with clay to bronze is because when I did my apprenticeship, that's what we did. So it was sculpted, molded, and cast. Resin bronze is always a cheap way of casting. bronze is the material, I think, because it has that heritage to it. The other way of sculpting, which I think a lot of people think about, is when sculpture is mentioned, is you're chipping away with a hammer and chisel on marble. And that's a very different line of sculpture. It's you are a stone worker, like Michelangelo was. He was brought up in that environment.
Our way of working is actually modelling and building up, isn't it? Whereas
is,
the other methods are carving away and cutting away. So for us, it's much easier to actually, if you make a mistake, it's not a major disaster. You haven't lost half of your precious marble. You can take off a bit of clay or add more, can't you? So it gives us a lot more flexibility.
Yeah. And it comes down to market forces as well. As a commercial sculptor doing commission work, predominantly, it's about time. So by the time the client has made up their mind, we've got very many weeks to be able to get the sculpture out.
Right.
So it's an ergonomic practicality, really, that has forced me down that route.
Is when you were talking about, or basically about kind of building up, chipping away. Yeah, and again, I mentioned Teddy and Jason Arkles in Florence, and Jason's amazing art historian and also a sculptor in Florence, and he primarily, I think this is right, works in marble sculpture, and he had a student there called Teddy, who I mentioned before. And again, we'll put pictures of Teddy's work online at some point. But Teddy, I said to Teddy, what's it like to sculpt in marble? Because he's kind of an apprentice or sort of learning the craft. And he was sculpting a man's idealized torso. And he said, well, it's a bit stressful because if I do the slightest kind of wrong move, then I could completely wreck my torso, my marble sculpture here. And, you could see he was like quite anxious about just judging something. And Andy, when we talked about this, when I got back from Florence, we had that conversation, and you were like, well, that's why I like working in clay, because rather than chipping away, I'm adding, and so it's just, there's lots of different reasons why sculptors choose to work with different materials, isn't there?
It's a visceral thing. It's what draws you in. The people that I've known that work in marble love the material. They love the heritage and the history behind it. It draws them in. There is a kind of spiritual element to it. In my world, I've always loved clay. I didn't want plasticine when I was little. I wanted clay.
Yeah.
And I still do. I find it, the problem with sculpture these days is there's no education there. There's nobody out there to teach good, realist art, sculptural techniques. So mistakes and learning by your mistakes is how you pick up your knowledge. So when I was learning, terrible mistakes were made because there's nobody there to teach me. And sculptures would literally fall in half. And also, I was picking up and moulding and casting a lot of other sculptors' work as well. And I can remember the incidences where they'd be phoning up in tears because their sculpture had fallen apart right at the end of the making. And it's because they hadn't made their armatures properly. The whole process was wrongly judged. So the armature's not strong enough. Everything starts to fall to pieces, and then it does right at the end. And then weeks and weeks and weeks of application, love, dedication have gone.
That might be a good point, because we're going to talk about this in like the second half of the podcast, but I feel that we can come back to different sculpting materials in a minute.
One of the things that whole part of my education taught me is that if I am not, or I found that if I was not involved emotionally with somebody else's sculpture, which of course I'm not, if it does fall to pieces, I would say 99.9% of the time, you can fix it. You can pick up the bits and put them all back together again. And I can think of a few instances where literally there was nothing left, where a sculpture that was that tall fell into pieces because it had been made as a kind of coil pot.
Right.
To the point where when I went into the room, there was a flat piece of plastic on the floor with a few bumps on it, which should have been a sculpture this high, but everything had come apart. And it's because of bad practice, really.
Yeah.
But that leads me back to what you were saying, is that, and one of the reasons why we enjoyed our week away so much is that we were forced to learn to use other materials that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
And I think it's vital that you keep pushing your boundaries in order to be able to embrace what's happening around us, because the world's changing so fast. New materials are coming out. Everything changes very, very quickly. And I think personally, I think it's really important to keep up with the times, particularly as I'm teaching, and particularly when there's young people coming in who want to move into the film industry, who are now going to be dealing with a whole load of new materials, that I'm not some old dinosaur giving away information that is no longer relevant. So,
and there was one of the ladies on the course does a lot of work with Super Sculpey and various other polymer clays, and she knew an awful lot about these different products that we had no idea about, really. So, and so her knowledge was very valuable, and she was very happy to share all that knowledge as well, wasn't she? So she was telling us about different polymer clays that we'd never heard of before, and some were flexible. And
so polymer is a type of clay, and
it's a synthetic clay, isn't
right.
it? It has different.
Can I just interject and just explain what it is?
Yeah.
So a polymer clay, as far as my understanding goes, is a synthetic material, a clay-like material, that once you have modeled it, you can then cook it in the oven at about 140 degrees, and you end up with a rock-hard product at the end of it, very hard product at the end of it. So in effect, it's circumnavigating the process that I've been familiar with all my life, which is molding and casting. And so I was particularly interested in having a look at Brian and Wendy's world and the students that they're studying with us, actually.
The only thing is with the polymer clays is that you get a one-off, so you can't repeat that same thing. So once it's been baked, that's it, unless you were to then mold it, I suppose. But usually they're creating one-offs, aren't they?
It's about the material providing a certain benefit.
Yes.
Which I'm always interested in. I've been using polymer clays for years and years and years, but only as a kind of backup to what I'm doing. Okay. So if I'm making a cow with horns, for example, or an elephant with tusks, the tusks and the horns, probably the ears as well, would be made in polymer clay and then baked hard so that I can just push it into the clay.
Right, okay.
So that's primarily how I've used it.
Yeah.
And we were talking about being open-minded. Yeah. It's good to be forced into a situation where you're using material in a way that I don't really want to, actually.
Yeah. When you say you don't really want to, is that because you feel like you're betraying the heritage of what
No.
Or is it just because you just really love what you work with normally, your material?
Clay to me is incredibly versatile to the point where nothing can beat it. I know in the film industry, for example, that you cannot make a sculpture out of clay because they need to make multiples of that particular piece, and you have to use a platinum cured rubber. Platinum cured rubber is very, very sensitive and problematic. So if you put it on clay, it will never set. So there are elements where you are forced down a certain route. But in my world, I use a simpler, more basic silicon that I know will set on any material.
I think that's quite interesting for listeners, and particularly maybe for people that don't know anything about sculpture, because we want as many people as possible to listen to our podcast, and we want it to be like accessible for everybody, whether you're interested in art and sculpture or not, or you're just listening because you've kind of stumbled across us. And I think it's like just being aware of all these different materials, and that they, a sculpture, you can sculpt in so many different ways, can't you? With so many different materials. Like earlier we were talking about kind of like stone and wood carving, or like stone and wood sculpture basically, and we often get quite a few stonemasons who want to come to the sculpture school, don't they?
We get wood carvers and also people in the cake industry, cake decorating industry, so we've had lots and lots of them come on our courses, don't we?
They seem to come in flurries.
Yeah.
So we get a lot. A few years ago we had a lot of wood carvers.
Yeah.
We get quite a lot of stone carvers as well. But stone carvers, if they want to sculpt in a realist fashion, have to learn to point and do it in the same way that Michelangelo would have done it.
But they usually make a maquette in clay first, don't they? Before they go on to carve. You can't
launch yourself into a piece of marble. Nobody can, not even Michelangelo. Everything comes from a maquette.
And just for listeners, a maquette, if you're unfamiliar, is like a small model, isn't it, of your sort of the piece that you're aiming to create.
Well, this is a maquette,
right? Okay.
Which we can talk about later.
Yeah. So for listeners, there's sort of so many different forms of material that you can use to create sculpture. There's different kind of genres of sculpture. So like we've talked about stonemason, wood carvers, working with polymer clay, working with clay and bronze, working with marble. Are there other materials that you'd like to talk about? I think, Di, was it you mentioned terracotta, or am I imagining that?
I think you might have imagined that.
Terracotta is clay.
Is clay.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry, I'm so much.
But there are a lot of ceramic artists around as well. Very, very good ceramic artists, actually. And so when the sculpture is being made, it's then fired.
Right.
And that's another way of making the sculpture permanent.
Yeah. So what if, for listeners, what are maybe the top few mediums or materials to sculpt in? So obviously I know, have we covered all of them? Or?
We've covered all of them, and I think it comes down to personal taste at the end of the day. It's about what relates to you the best.
Some people use plaster, don't they? Plaster of Paris.
I thought you were going to say poo then.
Well, they might do.
Sand sculpture as well. Sorry,
there is sand sculpture. Some people use plaster, don't they, to create from scratch?
Yeah, definitely they do.
So that's another option, and I think it's relatively cheap material to use, isn't it?
And it's relative to the person that's using it. I found in my career the people that are plaster sculptors loathe clay.
Right.
And personally, I loathe plaster. If sculpture was still relied on plaster, which it always did in the past for moulding, it would have a very detrimental effect on me.
And that's really interesting in terms of like how we all feel comfortable and have a preference for using a particular thing. I just wanted to ask before we sort of move on, in terms of, for anyone who's listening to this who would love to have a go at sculpture and is thinking sort of longer term, how accessible is it to get hold of some of these materials, and in terms of how much space would you need if you want to set up a little studio at home? And also cost-wise, like what kind of costs would somebody pay to get a bag of polymer clay or clay? And, like what's the whole, if you're completely new to this, what's involved?
Well, if you want to work at home at the kitchen table, which is the place that you work first if you're experimenting, it's got to be polymer clay or a plasticine type material. There's Chivant, for example, plastics. There's all sorts of things, materials out there that can be used. And you can buy it from, I suppose, Tarantis still do it, don't they?
There's
and Pottery Craft.
Hobby Crafts.
Yeah, Hobby Crafts will do it.
Free advertising here, folks.
Yeah.
And in terms of like cost-wise, like, what is the cost? So, Andy, like, for example, to get some clay like you work in, what's sort of a typical cost for that? Sorry. And then if you wanted to have your sculpture, I'm just thinking of people who'd like to go on to have what they've made in clay, moulded and cast. Could you give some ideas on
Sadly,
price?
hugely expensive.
Right.
I always look at painters with a kind of envy because if you bought a new canvas, new easel, new paints, new brushes, new everything, every time you made a painting, it would still be infinitely cheaper than sculpture is. One of the sad realities of sculpture is that the molding casting side of it is expensive.
Yeah.
And actually, it's very difficult to find good molders these days. Really difficult.
And if you went down the ceramics route where you're firing your clay, the actual water-based clay isn't expensive at all. Right. You can get a big bag of clay for not very much money. But if you've then created your sculpture to be fired, you've still got to either buy a kiln for yourself that you can have at home, or you've got to find a communal studio where you can share.
There's an evolution to this, I think, because most of the sculptors that I know started out as ceramic artists because I know I did, because I couldn't afford to mold and cast. It was out of the question. It's a good learning curve. And I think just by launching yourself into it and having fun is the beginning of how you learn all of this. To get bound up in all these questions and problems, it kills inspiration. So my advice is go out there and have a go and have fun. The reason why the waxes and plasticine type materials are good is because when you're at home at the kitchen table, you're not making a mess. If you use clay, interestingly, the mess is quite horrific because the clay dries on your hands, it dries on the table, it dries everywhere, creates a dust, and that dust floats into the air and lands on everything. And you also create a massive sort of, it's not a puddle because it's not wet, but it's clay is dropped all over the floor. And then you get that on the bottom of your shoes and tread it through the hall as you walk back.
You have to just love the creative process, like all of it, don't you?
So my suggestion is if you want to use clay, buy yourself a little shed in the back garden or something. And
that sounds very therapeutic. And therapy is like another element that we're going to come back to at some point.
It is all about having fun and just experimenting and finding out what really floats your boat.
We should say at this point as well that Andy and Di, on their website, you sell an online course for anyone that can't come to the sculpture school, because we are in Devon, which we appreciate is a little bit of a trek for some people if you're up in the north of Scotland or something. But yeah, you can buy our online course. It's 14 lessons, isn't it? And also you can buy our starter pack. And in our starter pack, you have everything you need to get going.
So there's some clay, there's a figurative armature, calipers, some tools, the charts,
all the basics,
everything that you need just to get going on the online course.
So tell the listeners more about armatures now, because Di, I know you said that you've come across people before that would kind of like create like a sort of hodgepodge armature at home, and then
oh
things
my
go horribly
goodness,
wrong.
we used to see some terrible things come in at Andy's old studio when he was having his moulding and casting business fully functioning, and people would come in with sculptures propped up on knitting needles and kitchen towel holders, and they'd come in and expect Andy to be able to mould it, and they were just unbelievable, weren't they?
Yeah, dark days.
Very unstable.
So if someone is working at home and for example, they haven't got a starter pack from us, what should they use for an armature? And sort of,
my suggestion is download our armature making video.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's very straightforward. You get a very, very good universal armature from that. And the thing about learning a system that is that works is that it gives you a foundation that stops you from worrying and becoming anxious about the result of what's going to happen when you sculpt, because whatever material you're using, it becomes very heavy, heavier than you think it's going to become by miles. And armatures that aren't properly made just buckle and fail under the weight. So have a look at the video. Everything builds upon the way that I've created the armatures. So it's like a bit of wire origami, really.
And you can buy online. You can get armature wire of all different widths, can't you? And over the years, you've found that the square armature wire is much better because it holds the clay better, doesn't it? You can get round armature wire, but the square armature wire is much more effective. So, I mean, I've made armatures before and have not understood how heavy the clay is. And, you end up with your head sort of flopping to one side because you haven't made an armature that's strong enough. So it's very important to understand what you're creating.
It is interesting that even with years and years of experience, mistakes with the armature happen easily. When I was working on the Duke of Wellington sculpture, there was a lot of time pressure on that. And there's a figure within that composition, which is a First World War officer going over the top, blowing his whistle. Right. And he's holding a revolver. And he's merged into the edifice that the sculpture is built upon. And so I made an armature that just attached to the steel part of the edifice that was made entirely out of this armature wire, the thickest armature wire. And the way that it's made is you make the armature to the correct proportions. You then cover it in polystyrene.
When it's a life-size one.
Yeah, if it's life-size. So that you're only putting on 1 inch to 2 inches of clay maximum. So we keep the weight down and the sheer quantity of clay really, really as low as you can keep it. And I was in a rush and I don't know, it just wasn't thinking straight, basically. And I just assumed in this rush that because it was attached to the main part of the frame, that aluminium would be okay. And I accidentally set fire to it. Oh, so as I was gluing the polystyrene into position, I noticed there was a little bit that needed some welding. So I welded. Now, normally, if you weld above polystyrene, it is not the effect that you think it would be. It burns its way through, but it doesn't set it on fire. Yeah. Modern polystyrene, particularly for insulation, is non-flammable. But if you've just glued it, the fumes from the glue are flammable, extremely flammable in actual fact. So one flash of the weld and poof, the whole thing went up in flames. And I had to just back off and leave it to burn out.
Oh,
and it was serendipitous because if I hadn't done that, if it hadn't caught fire, I would have made an armature that would have done exactly what I've just said you shouldn't do. Yeah. 3/4 of the way through, it would have collapsed under its own weight.
I was thinking a little bit, although it's different, but when you're talking about that, I remember seeing a brilliant kind of like documentary film starring Hugh Bonneville ages ago, and it was about Sir Christopher Wren building St. Paul. I think he designed and built St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and like trying to get all the proportions of the dome right so it could support the weight. And I think that's a thing. And to be fair, I haven't really been thinking about this element of your sculptures, about you have to sort of think ahead so much about. Yeah, I was just thinking about the armature in terms of providing that sort of skeleton, that sort of like structure. But I wasn't really thinking, I hadn't really thought through like the element of you've got to not maybe calculate, but you've got to be very aware of how much clay you're putting on top of the armature so that it's not going to buckle and it can support itself.
Well, when Andy's doing the big commissions, say the one of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, the armature is a huge part of the actual design, isn't it? And with a life-size figure, you're often using steel first of all, aren't you? To create the strength in the legs, and it's all about the sort of engineering and the actual design process, isn't it? It's if the armature isn't right and you haven't thought it through, that's your design gone, isn't it? Making an armature is
it is. I was just thinking of the sculptors that have inspired me that I've worked with over the years, and the ones that really stand out in my mind are the ones that created the best armatures, because they would be figures on 1 foot, for example. Or beautifully balanced when it's twice life size, so it'd be 12 feet tall.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I really hadn't thought how important the armature is. So I think that's such a important thing to take away from today's podcast, isn't it? About, the armature isn't kind of like a throwaway thing that you don't need to worry about. It's actually one of the most important elements of your sculpture.
It's a top secret tip, really.
It's a top secret tip, but also it's the thing that upsets most people.
Yeah.
They don't want to make the armature because they don't know how and it's too difficult.
Right.
So they rush into the sculpting aspect of it, and that's where the mistakes happen.
Yeah. So it's like get your foundation right first, which
Absolutely.
is the armature.
Yeah, I really recommend watching the video because it is a universal armature. You can have as many arms and legs as you want, so you could create a creature for a film industry, for example. You can do it in different thicknesses of wire. Build up anything up to a life-size figure. And I use that kind of armature wire even in 9-foot figures, for example, but in moderation only where it's needed because of the weight factor. We're in good company, actually, if anything does go wrong. You think of the towers that Bernini built in the Vatican. It wasn't his fault. I rushed to support him, but he assumed that the foundations had already been laid by a previous architect, were strong enough to take the weight of the towers that he created. And sadly, that simply wasn't the case. So the towers don't exist because they cracked and fell apart.
But I guess the lesson is to always do your prep, isn't it? To always do your homework, to make sure that, you've got, if you're building something up with weight attached, that you've got the structure underneath to support it.
It's tiresome and people hate it because it doesn't flow from the soul.
It doesn't feel arty,
It doesn't feel arty.
Yeah.
But ignore it at your own consequence.
It's a little bit like, I know this is probably a really poor example, but it's a bit like if you're painting a room at home, isn't it? And the best result comes from if you do your preparation before, you put the ground sheet down, you put your kind of tape around, anything you don't want to get paint on. And it's the boring bit before you can crack on with the painting.
Yeah.
But it's like that, I guess, with getting the armature right and the sort of foundations right. And Andy, as you were saying about Bernini, he was like if you're doing any kind of a sculpture, which is all anything along those lines where it's a much bigger sort of piece, then you need to think about the weight bearing mechanisms, the foundations. So before we wrap up this third podcast episode, I wanted just to say to people listening and watching, we're going to start a new part of our podcast going forward from episode 4, which is going to be, we would love to hear from you, our listeners. If you have a particular question you'd like to ask you can ask any of us, but a sculpting question or anything about art or literally a question that's relevant to our podcast. So please do email to the Sculpture School, or you can message us on social media. Any of your questions, and every podcast episode we will pick out a question and we will sort of answer it during part of the podcast. But before we wrap up, Andy, can you tell us about your sculpture here?
Yes. We were talking earlier about maquettes, and a maquette is a rough sketch that you present to your client that is paying for the sculpture to show them what it will look like in 3 dimensions, because a drawing doesn't work properly, because you need imagination to be able to interpret a drawing. And you need to be able to see it from all sides, from all angles. So a maquette does exactly that. So what I brought in is a maquette of a piece that we're trying to get into Kingston.
Kingston upon Thames.
Kingston upon Thames, thanks, Sunny. I'm working with a friend of mine. We worked together on various projects in the past. I didn't know this originally, but this is a sculpture of King Athelstan, who was Alfred the Great's grandson. Who was the first king of England to become literally the king of United England. That's England, Scotland, and Wales. In fact, he was an incredible figure. The more I read about him, the more impressed I am by what he actually achieved in his lifetime, considering he died in his early 40s as well. He didn't have much time. So the maquette itself is a creation of his life story, really, as much as I could get into the composition itself. So we got him creating laws. He knew and had read about the Romans and about their laws, and he felt that the way to rule a country was through fair meritocracy. Actually, as far as I can see, he was quite an amazing man. Within that composition, I've got a woman standing in the background. That woman is Alfred the Great's daughter. Her name was Ethelfled, and she was the Queen of Mercia, which is, in effect, the Midlands of England, right up to Chester. And she made the old Roman towns into trading market towns that created a kind of power within that area that kept the Vikings at bay, because one of the biggest problems they had during that period was incursions from the Vikings. Probably one of the greatest queens that our country's ever had, that nobody's ever heard of. And she was Athelstan's surrogate mother, although she was officially his auntie. He lived with her and was brought up with her. On the top of the throne is a raven. That raven represents the pagan Viking threat. The dog represents a moment in time. It's like we could have a dog in here now. It'd just be a dog. It's the dog.
It's just like a constant theme
It's
of
a constant
time,
theme of time. And I just love that idea of this constant theme of time.
And I like you've got a shield, haven't you? And the helmet, which very much signifies, and they're beautifully kind of decorated in really intricate detail, but it signifies that constant threat of war, doesn't it, as well?
It does, but it's part of the research that goes into it to make sure that everything is authentic. I made a mistake, actually, on this. The maquettes are sketches of how the sculpture is going to look.
Right.
Somehow these days I seem to have got caught up in my own perfectionism, and the maquette becomes a sculpture in its own right.
Yeah, no, because I literally thought it was the sculpture.
Well, it is now, really. But it will be life. It will be life and a half, hopefully.
It would be great if it was.
Yeah.
So life and a half, you mean life size and a half?
And a half.
Right. Makes the figure.
And you said it's going to hoping to go to Kingston?
Hopefully to Kingston upon Thames.
What, outside?
Yes, they're hoping it's going to be near the King's Stone.
Okay.
I don't think a location has been decided yet, but
it's beautiful.
It is stunning. Actually, you could explain how many armatures there are in this, just to illustrate. So you had a figurative armature for the Ethelfled, for King Athelstan as well, plus the dog.
Yes.
Didn't you?
Yes.
And the raven.
The armatures, interestingly, are not
and
always.
The throne.
Yeah, well, the armatures are not always for support. With things like the dog, that dog could be sculpted without an armature, without any doubt whatsoever. But with an armature, you've got all the proportions built in, so you know exactly where the wrists are, exactly where the elbows are, exactly where the scapulae happen to be on the animal, so that you get this fantastic platform on which to sculpt. So when I'm sculpting on a good armature, I know exactly where the xiphoid process is. I know exactly where the jugular notch is. So when I'm applying the clay, it looks like it's done by magic, because all that groundwork, all the proportions are already worked out.
That's something we could touch on maybe in the next episode, or perhaps an episode, quite soon, is about when you're sculpting an animal, because we haven't really talked an awful lot about sort of animal sculpture yet. But again, how to get those kind of features and things like their coats and, different proportions, right? Just finally, but it's absolutely beautiful. Finally, before we go, Di, can you tell us what courses are upcoming at the Sculpture School over the next few weeks?
We've got a Taste of Sculpture day coming up tomorrow, actually.
Okay.
And then there's an animal Taste of Sculpture, I believe, the following week.
Yeah.
And then we have a figurative course later on in the month.
Figurative course is 4 days?
4 days, yes, that's a full 4 days.
Okay.
So.
And and also for listeners and viewers, just to say that we do also do a 1-year Learn to Sculpt course, and that basically involves 4 days a month, doesn't it? And then there's lots of tuition, extra tuition,
homework in between, assignments,
all sorts of different things that go on. And you take part. Well, you build a portfolio, don't you, of your own work, and then you exhibit that at the end of the year. Go on, Andy, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say what I found interesting about that year course is that it does take study. It takes dedicated study.
Homework. Yeah.
We've had one or two students that I think they believe that they can buy talent.
Yeah.
And it really does. It's a bit of a shock when you realize that you have to study like you would do in any course, any university. It is about the effort that you put in. That's what I call the learning side of things, is how you learn is study. You'll understand that completely. The tuition is a kind of groundwork, like a map that helps you, but the real learning comes from you and your efforts. And it's a sobering fact that sculpture like this requires quite a lot of study. If you're thinking about rules of thumb, design criteria, which is how muscles fit together, the muscles and bones themselves, which is a crochet, the way that the muscles relate to each other, which is rhythm, all of these factors meld together in your mind and in your expertise to help you make a sculpture that moves beyond the bounds of reality. You don't think it is. That looks like Athelstan sitting on his throne with Ethelfled as a wraith standing in the background because she would have been dead by the time he became king. It all looks practical. That's what it is. But the reality of it is that there's an awful lot of thought, understanding, triangulation, squares, circles that create a design that's pleasing to look at, without the observer being aware of how they're being influenced.
No, it's incredible.
There's a little touch of magic to that, which I find incredibly exciting. And what I really want to get across through these podcasts is that it's these little secrets in the background that make this the wow factor that it needs to be.
No, it's just beautiful. And every time I look at it, there are so many details that I see with fresh eyes, and it's just, it just keeps on giving.
It's that narrative, isn't it? It's a story.
Yes, you've got to remember that maquettes they're the second go at the composition. The first go is a drawing. The second go is this, where I've created it as I think of it at the time. But to me, it's an ongoing living thing. And
so it could,
it changes. It evolves every single time.
Yeah.
So now I don't want a raven sitting on the top passively. I want two ravens that represent the two ravens. I can never remember their names, but they were Odin's spies. So they would come back and relate what was going on in the human world.
And on the back, you have planned to put some battle scenes or something. Did
but
you?
I left three frames
panels
on little panels on the back that were to have three events from his life. So one of them would certainly have been he released his slaves, and he didn't believe in slavery. I mean, he wouldn't have been cancelled by today's standards. He fought the Vikings at a place called Brunum Burr that we've now just discovered was on the Wirral, and he faced 26,000 Scots, Welsh, Vikings, and Irish in that battle, which was absolutely terrifying in those days, because a large army or an ordinary army in those days would have been about 800 men.
Also, you think of the weight. I know when I used to sort of teach some of the military history and battles across time, and you think of the weight of what their sword, for example, what they had to carry. It's just it's almost like we just cannot comprehend what they had to deal with.
No, they were a different type of human, really. They were so different. Tough.
Yeah, enormously, and so super fit. But we are going to leave it there for today, because we could just talk all afternoon about this incredible sculpture. And from a historical perspective, I always am so drawn into this time in history. But that's for another podcast. So we will leave it there for today. But thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.